meeting on the webcast and on Twitter using the hashtags Assembly Housing and Housing Strategy. I would also like to welcome the councillors that we have visiting from the London Borough of Haringey today. Thank you very much for coming. Can I remind everyone in the room to please turn your phones off and put them on silent? And do we have any apologies for today's meeting?
We have not received any apologies.
No. Thank you. Item 2 on today's agenda is declarations of interest. Can I ask members to note the list of offices on the report and ask if you have any additional interest to declare? No, thank you. Item 3 is minutes. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Housing Committee held on the 5th of October 2017 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Item 4 is a summary list of actions. Can I ask members to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings?
Noted.
Thank you. Item 5 is action taken under delegated authority. Can the committee note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority to agree an output from the discussion on hidden homelessness?
Agreed.
We did that already, so that's good that you agree. Item 6. This is our main item today, a discussion on the Mayor's draft housing strategy. We're going to have 2 panels today. On the first panel, we've got external guests who can give us a range of their views on the draft housing strategy. We'll aim to finish that in about 45 minutes or so, but please feel free to talk in as full a way as you like about the issues that you're bringing in. The second panel will have the opportunity to ask the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development all about the strategy, and I'm glad to see he's already here. Thank you very much for coming. So our guests for panel 1, we have from the right here, we have Paul Hackett, the Chief Executive of Optivo, and he's the chair of the G15, which is a group of large housing associations. Then we have Richard Blyth, who is the Head of Policy at the Royal Town Planning Institute. We have Barry Mortimer, who's the Director of the Federation of Master Builders London branch. And we have Pat Turnbull from the London Tenants Federation, who represent Social and Housing Association, Council and Housing Association Tenants. Thank you very much. So, moving on to our first questions. I would like to start, if possible, with Paul Hackett from the G15. Housing associations, obviously going to be quite crucial in delivering a lot of the homes that Londoners need. Do you need the Mayor to help you with this land fund that he's proposing? How much difference will that make to the kind of homes that you can deliver?
It will make a significant difference. We buy land in the market, and as G15 we have committed to start 42,000 homes by March 2021. So it's a big increase for us. We're planning to build 28,000, but we increase the numbers because of the Mayor's flexible programmes that we have with strategic partnerships. So the scale of the ambition is greater, but equally the scale of the challenge is greater. We will carry on buying sites in the normal way through the open market, but I would hope that this mechanism would enable other sites to come forward that would otherwise not come to market. So a good example is the Webb's industrial estate in Waltham Forest that one of our members, Catalyst, has recently acquired from the GLA, and they will build that site out as 100% affordable, 330 homes on that site. So we're beginning to see things happening already with a more interventionist position from GLA on land. We think there are great opportunities there, potentially in town centres, including more suburban town centres, where land assembly is necessary, where there's a need perhaps for remediation, perhaps using CPO powers, but I think it's only going to work if we have the boroughs and the GLA and housing associations all working together, showing will to make it work. We can bring in our balance sheet, our capacity to do back-to-back deals, our development skills, but we definitely need the strategic powers of the GLA and our borough partners. And there's lots of very good work going on already around London on some of these issues with a number of different boroughs, I'm pleased to say.
So there are plenty of bits of land that you have your eye on already that this land fund can help with?
There certainly are, and our members are actually bringing forward sites that they think, with a bit of smart land assembly, we could achieve some interesting schemes. And I think the Mayor's said on a number of occasions that solving the housing crisis is a marathon, not a sprint. And I would see this London Land Fund approach as being a long to medium term solution. Great if we get sites like Webb's Industrial Estate coming forward quickly, but I think there'll be other sites that, because of their nature and complexity, will take longer. And I think this approach, which is about collaboration, backed up with funding and backed up with, hopefully with CPO or the threat of CPO, might enable sites to come forward quickly.
It's a revolving fund, and presumably that means that the Mayor's going to want the money back at some point. Do you have an idea at the moment about the capacity of housing associations at the kinds of rents that we need to be charged?
Yeah.
The ability of you to pay that money back within what the period might be?
Well, I think the ideal situation would be the Mayor funds the remediation work or the planning work or the preparation work, and then the housing associations are ready to acquire the site at a particular trigger point, at planning, for example. And then buy the site based upon a valuation that reflects the amount of affordable that's involved. So Catalyst bought the site from the GLA. That site valuation will reflect the tenure mix they have on that site. So I think the money will come back in again because we're not asking for free land. What we're asking for is assistance in actually bringing sites forward and doing some of that preparation work to enable them to be ready to develop.
Okay, so the money comes back basically at the point at which you buy it. Okay. Given the potential you've talked about, is £250 million enough to make a real difference?
I think it will make a real difference to 2,500 or whatever plots that can deliver. But clearly there's always a desire to see more, and I think with the strategic housing market assessment suggesting we now need 66,000 homes in London, the quantum of need is greater than we previously understood. So the challenge is enormous. Personally, I do think we need more resources to come into London to help to make the step change that we need, and this fund I would see as being one of a number of different mechanisms to enable social housing providers of all stripe to deliver more homes in London.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I move on to Richard Blyth for your views on this fund, particularly whether there's any risk in buying up sort of unwanted sites? Is that going to make the sites more risky? What's your view on the approach that's being taken?
Well, I'm very glad that the Mayor and in sort of coincidentally with national politicians and some wider range of thinkers are actually coming round to the view that it's not the planning system that stops housing being built. Although there are some sections in the strategy which seem to suggest otherwise, some throwaway comments, but it's encouraging that there's an understanding that actually things like getting land assembled and ready is very important. Not really an expert on financial risk. I mean, London's current housing market is sort of plateaued. I think there is a question around making sure that public money is not exposed to excess risk in a situation, because this is a different kind of activity from granting planning permissions. So if the Mayor has land on his books, then there is a question about making sure that it isn't bought too high, and then if there are changes in the market, then it's sort of left too low. So, but you're probably better speaking to somebody who's like a housing finance expert on that point.
Do you have any expertise or views on the kind of land that might be suitable for this fund? The idea of land assembly sounds very attractive. Adding more bits to existing sites.
I point the committee to the very interesting work, which you may already know very well, the Outer London Commission did. And I think particularly those familiar with some of the Outer London town centres will know that they are not what they were in their heyday in the 30s. And one of the problems is sort of insufficient demand for retailing, heavy use of the car in outer London, which has kind of made some places definitely seem past their best. And I think if that could be used to assemble sites near tube stations, railway stations in outer London, which also might overcome some of the difficulties of perhaps intensifying sites that are further away from tube stations that might be more traditionally residential and where you might come across some quite powerful local opposition, whereas the town centres, I think, are a very good place to start.
That sounds like a much more integrated way of combining transport and housing planning together than we've maybe had in the past. Okay, thank you. Moving on. Thank you. Tony, you now asking some more questions about small sites.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to Barry, please. Do we need a presumption in favour of residential development on small sites?
Yes, so we strongly support the idea. We think it's extremely important. We think that it's very, very important. We think that cumulatively small sites could make a huge contribution to house building in London. There has been a serious loss of SME house builders, and we feel that there is a very big contribution that they could be making. I'm not completely sure on how many small sites there actually are in London. The last time we commissioned any research was with the LSE, who did a research project, and this was a while back, but their estimates were around about 300,000. That wasn't in London, that was across England.
So 300,000 is the potential
units.
for 300,000.
Yeah, so we believe there's a huge potential. We've got builders, in terms of Federation of Master Builders, we've got around about 45% of our builders are house builders. They build very, very quickly. We partner with local authorities, so we have a national partnership with local authority building control. So we see a huge potential there. We would like to see small sites allocated as part of local plans, and that increases the chance that they actually will get built, because there's a lot of risk for a small builder. So if they're not part of local plans, when sites are brought forward, that can cause issue with planning teams. They tend to have a focus on the big projects. We find that often with the smaller sites, they're dealt with by junior staff. Sometimes there's questions raised which might be quite minor but hold the project up. It has to go up the line. I could give you some examples, but we find that the planning system for small builders is in many respects stacked against them in a number of areas. And we've also done some research with the local government information unit, which has looked at a whole range of local authorities. So we've done research with planning teams, with builders, and that does highlight some of the issues. So 64% of small builders see under-resourcing of planning departments as a barrier. 45% of local authorities agreed. So this presumption in terms of residential development being part of local plans, I think could help unlock some of the problems and barriers that small builders have in terms of getting houses actually through the system and ultimately built.
Thank you. Can I move on to Richard, really, and ask about the risks in introducing this policy?
Well, I think one of the difficulties of this session and this committee is that the detail will appear in the London plan, not in the housing strategy. So we are kind of, in a way, making some suppositions. I think what presumption means needs unpacking. Normally, speaking for the whole country, not just London, sites that are white on the local plan have a presumption for housing development in any case. So there isn't really a need at that level to say that housing development can happen in principle unless sites are either identified as for a different purpose, like employment, or a local planning authority has a policy to say, for example, we do not wish to see a loss of cinemas to housing, or we do not wish to see a loss of community centres. And they might be identified on the proposals map, but they are identifiable in the sense that it will be a change of use. The second level, which I think maybe what the FMB is perhaps getting at more, is the number of units that might be put on a small site. And this is where presumptions get very difficult, because an applicant might want 20 units on the site, and actually by the time it's been through an assessment, a professional assessment and a planning committee decision, they might end up with 12. Now in that case we couldn't have a presumption that the number permitted on a site was the same as the applicant might want, even though the principle of residential development is accepted, and there's a lot of difference in terms of contribution to London's housing needs and the value of a scheme between 20 and 12 units. I would agree that it would be great if more sites could be allocated somehow in plans. The question is that we are facing, as has been suggested, a serious shortage of local planning staff across the country, and London is better than some places because London's quite an attractive place to come and work. We're having this discussion in Lincolnshire. I think the problems would be more complicated. So if you're going to have a local plan that allocates sites of say 4 or 5 on the proposals map, that requires staff to go out and effectively decide that site is suitable and what capacity it can maintain, which is quite a lot of discussion with neighbours and that kind of thing. So when we say stacked against small sites, that is partly due to the amount of work that is involved in having to assess each small site separately. It'd be great if we could do that. I'm not sure, it's never happened before, or when I was working in plan making we always had 5 as the minimum, and that was in places that were fairly, where you were using the background housing areas as the main source of supply, let alone areas with large sites to contend with as well. So great, but can we actually resource it?
Thank you. My last question, which I'm not sure you'll be able to answer without a crystal ball, I'm sure Deputy Mayor will answer it later, is how much difference will specific targets for small sites actually make?
I don't know how a specific target for small sites would work, but again, this is a question of the detail of the London plan. But if you were to say all boroughs must have 20% of their sites being small, I don't quite know how you would be able to make that work. And if you said, if the mayor was to say Greenwich is going to have so many thousand small sites, unless there had been that preceding research and preparation, I'm not quite sure that you would know what the small site capacity of, say, Greenwich was, because it needs those assessments.
Great. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Nikki, would you have a follow-up?
Can I just, thank you, and continuing small sites, can I just ask, is there, is there a request that we, or a direction that we should have a target of residential on small sites in the housing strategy? Where's that target come from, the idea of targets? No, nobody knows. We can ask James in the next session.
Oh, we will.
We will, okay. Just, yes, I just want to just make sure we're on the same page. Small site is anything from under 0.25 hectares, yes? Richard?
Well, that would depend in which place you are. Now, I'm not familiar with the London plan in sufficient detail to know whether that's the definition that the mayor uses.
I think it is, and that would get about, could get about 50, if it was up to the maximum, 0.25, it would get about 50 houses on it. Maybe, it depends what density, but just trying to get some sort of sense here.
Yes.
Yes? Talking anyway. I think small sites are really interesting in terms of residential capacity, but up till now, they haven't been coming forward. What do you think's been stopping boroughs from bringing them forward, Richard? And then I'll go on and ask others.
Well, the point I was making that...
well, the planning resource.
Yes, if you're hard-pressed to produce a local plan, and we have had, even now, I'm tomorrow finishing my response to the government on another change to how to write local plans, which is the change in the objectively assessed need methodology. Frequent changes in the process plus a shortage of people will mean that I have every sympathy with the local plan department struggling to get the local plans through, that may be a reason why small sites haven't been allocated to the extent that small sites happen. The usual term for them is windfalls, and much of the time windfalls are understood to be a major contribution to housing supply, especially in places which are constrained, say, by a green belt and therefore don't expand.
My experience is that, it's quite a long time ago now, I was chair of planning, but my experience is that it mainly comes from windfalls. I'd agree with that. Does anyone else want to come in on why they haven't been coming forward? Because I think it's not just planning resources.
I think there's an inherent disincentive for local authorities to bring through...
Can you just...
I think there's an inherent disincentive for local authorities to bring through small sites because of the reduced resources in planning teams. And those small sites, if you drive a lot of them through the system, and going back to your question about risk, you will need to, considerably increase the resources within those teams, and that can cause a problem. It also raises an issue in terms of conflict from nearby neighbours and objections, but because there isn't a presumption in favour of the small sites, that causes a problem with the builders and the small developers. So we do a national survey of house builders and small house builders, and over the years, consistently, for the last 3 years, the lack of available and viable land has been the number one reason why small builders are either not bringing forward projects or actually moving out of house building and moving into lofts or basements or whatever. Lack of finance is also an issue, and this really came about during the recession, and we still haven't worked through that, and our latest survey says that's actually marginally worse than the previous year. And third is issues and problems within the planning system. And then finally, on a great long list, but I'm just going to mention the top 4, the shortage of skilled workers is also a rising issue, particularly in certain trades. So all of those things combine, and there's a consistent picture through our national polling which highlights those reasons.
Do you think, we've just produced, the planning committee's just produced a report on off-site manufactured housing. Do you think, because that develops, it's not necessarily taking up on it's additional to construction skills, but it manufactured in a factory, craned on site, very little disruption. Because my experience of being a chair of planning is a lot of reasons that these small sites don't get developed is because of the reaction from around them, and often they're landlocked, so to speak, and there's a lot of disruption. There's a whole access problem, and I think the way OSM off-site manufactured homes, precision manufactured homes, the way they're sort of craned in and very speedy delivery and very few deliveries anyway would make a difference. Do you think that would make a difference?
I don't completely agree with you about the difficulties. There are many small sites across London, so we're doing research at the moment that we're going to be releasing in December about the opportunities, and we'll be making policy recommendations about spaces above shops because of the way town centre use is changing. There's lots and lots of very small old car parks with little lock-up garages. A modern car, you drive them in, you can't get out because they're all built too small. There's a whole raft of different places, and actually the small builders are really geared up to work on those things. And although and they are already producing. I was looking at one of our members the other day, master builder, who's doing modular lofts. So the lofts are built in Yorkshire. They're driven down on the back of a lorry in a couple of bits, and they're craned in and they're put up very, very rapidly, very high quality. So that sort of work where there is a demand and those sorts of building techniques are there. It's just getting these small sites actually available. You've got a whole army of builders in and all around London.
Okay,
really.
I get it. So what more? Well, I want to bring you in too, Paul. But what could the mayor do then? Could he do more than he is doing?
I think.
How can the mayor help then?
I think
it's there in the housing strategy.
I think that the housing strategy is a really welcome and significant step forward. I think that we do need a really diverse approach. We can't, I don't think, lock up everything in terms of the really big projects. If we're going to solve the housing crisis, which is decades in the making, it's not going to happen overnight, but we do need a really diverse approach. I think we need to work strategically. I think there needs to be small sites working groups. I would like to see co-location of housing and planning teams, using council assets creatively, directly commissioning joint ventures, deferred payment, adequately resourcing planning departments, engaging with the industry so policy doesn't just appear out of a vacuum, so there is regular dialogue, conversation between authorities, landowners, builders. And I think one of the big things for small builders is reducing risk and uncertainty so that there is some chance that when those plans are going in, they are actually going to go through. They're not going to be at the bottom of the pile. They are going to be dealt with because they are small builders. They need to get that work done. The easiest bit for a small builder in London to build a house is to do the building work. The rest of it is where the difficulties and the delays, and that would I think that would help to develop lasting relationships between builders and developers. I think you'd get more homes built much faster, and actually there's an added benefit in terms of jobs. And if you think about it, small builders actually train 67% of all the apprentices in the country. Micro firms train 67% of apprentices are trained by the small companies, 46% by micro companies. With Brexit and what that might lead to, we're already seeing people leaving the building industry in London. There's also an added benefit because we need the workforce of the future.
I get it. Sorry,
that was my bit of a rant.
We're quite constrained for time, but thank you. Okay, Paul, is there anything you want to bring in on here? What could the mayor do? Because we're hearing about all the different, a whole host of barriers actually to bringing forward small sites. So what more can be done?
Okay, well, so I think a strategic approach at borough level and at GLA-wide level. Housing associations have always liked building small sites, to be honest with you, because they're located within communities, they often have infrastructure around them. Building infill has been something that we've done historically over many, many years. The issue for housing associations these days tends to be around viability of those schemes. So if there's a way that we can aggregate up smaller sites, particularly publicly owned land.
Aggregate, that's a good term.
Them, okay. And have bigger programs that we can then work with the supply chain to try and get some of the efficiencies and scale economies you get with bigger schemes by packaging up a series of sites for housing associations.
Now wait a minute, have you got experience of this? Because in fact aggregation is the word that's used a lot.
Yeah.
Some boroughs are beginning to aggregate sites.
Yeah, well, we've seen TfL bringing forward their smaller sites as a package, so that could be an interesting way of doing things. And of course, you could find a way of optimising value by having 100% private on certain sites, affordable, 100% affordable on other sites, in order to improve the overall viability of a package. So I think there are things we can do. I think the other thing is CPO. If there's a way that we can bring more land forward through more proactive use of the powers of local government, I think that would certainly help. But there's a huge appetite. People like living in schemes, in infill developments within wider communities, near shops, near schools, near their friends. I think if we can provide those sorts of schemes rather than the very big scheme, or as well as the very big schemes, to achieve the output we need, we shouldn't rule out any scale of development. We need everybody to do their bit. And of course, there are smaller housing associations for whom they're not making as much investment, but when they do invest, place is incredibly important to them. So finding schemes that fit within their portfolio for smaller HAs, and we've been talking to the G320, the group of very small housing associations, trying to find ways to encourage them to do more and use their balance sheet. So I think there is an opportunity to bring more players into the market, SME house builders, SME contractors, and small and medium-sized housing associations.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. We haven't got separate questions on it, but the Mayor does have a section in the housing strategy about diversifying the house building market. Barry, just one word if you can. Are you happy about that? Are you happy with the section, or do you want?
Really, yes, very, very supportive.
Great.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, you.
I'm pleased you are, because I think we, the Assembly, asked for it first to be included, this particular emphasis on small sites. Can I just clear up one thing with you? Do you think there will be, Mr. Mortimer, do you think there would be some advantage in boroughs merging their planning departments with their neighbours?
I think do not some London boroughs actually push their work out to, I've heard some boroughs are using departments in Suffolk or Norfolk to try and help with the overspill of work. Is that something that you're aware of? But yes, I think that...
Something's happening already, but some boroughs quite, they don't like the idea, feel that there's some kind of lack of control if they merge in with other boroughs.
I mean, however it's done, if we're going to build a number of houses, capacity and workloads will increase, and so there has to be whatever is the most equitable solution. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. My question is really about about high density and densification. How can the Mayor and the boroughs ensure that higher density development is popular with Londoners? And perhaps I should go to Pat Turnbull first on this. Obviously there's...
Well, I haven't said anything so far, so I hope you'll excuse me if I take a couple of minutes of your time.
Of course.
So far, a couple of things have struck me. Somebody talked about unwanted sites. Who decides what's unwanted? The second point is industrial sites. We're supposed to be protecting them because of the danger of loss of jobs. So I think whenever we look at the question of sites, a number of questions should be taken into consideration, and those are just two of them. But so far, all we've talked about is the numbers of homes, and not surprisingly, I'm sure, what London Tenants Federation is particularly concerned about is what will be the types of homes that are built and who will be able to afford to live in them. And we note, to our regret, that the Mayor in the London housing strategy continues to use the term affordable homes and has even extended it and is now using the term genuinely affordable homes. And neither of these categories appear to be affordable when we examine them closely to at least half of Londoners. I'll tell you why we say that. The London living rent is available to people with a household income of up to £60,000. Shared ownership is available to people with a household income of up to £90,000. Now, the median income in London is £39,000, and just to make the scale of the difference even greater, the average household income of people currently in social rented housing is £17,500. So the Mayor has got these three... and I should say that the London affordable rent, when you actually look at it closely, even it is more expensive than current social rents in council and housing association properties. So who is all this new housing for? It looks to us as if the majority of the Mayor's £3.15 billion, which is so frequently talked about, is actually going to subsidise housing for people in the wealthier half of the community. Think of that, the median, and then what's above it, and then what's below it. Apparently the SHMA for Brent, Hammersmith and Ealing indicated that only 7% of those needing affordable housing could afford shared ownership, and only a further 7% could afford London living rent. So that's two of the three categories are actually unaffordable to most Londoners. And our problem is there are a number of statements in the Mayor's housing strategy which don't seem to correspond with what's actually in the strategy itself. So, for example, the strategy says social housing forms the foundation of our mixed city. And it says the Mayor wants to make the capital a city for all Londoners. Well, these phrases have a somewhat hollow ring when we examine the actual contents of the policy, and it's not going to deliver that. If I can just come in on one or two of the other points. For example, you said density. Well, if Londoners are losing space and are increasingly packed together, and they see this as for the sake of building more housing they can't afford to live in, they'll look askance at it, won't they? Because everybody does value their bit of space. Housing estates value their little bits of green, and they're losing them increasingly. Those housing estates were actually planned to have those bits of green because the rest of the housing estate was quite dense and had quite high buildings in it. Regeneration, exactly the same problem applies. If you're talking about social rented homes being lost and being replaced by unaffordable ones, people are going to resist regeneration. And we have another problem about the regeneration question, which since this is my opportunity to raise it, I'm going to raise it. And that is that we still don't have the Mayor's Good Practice Guide. And we're now being asked to comment on this policy before the 7th of December without actually having the Mayor's Good Practice Guide to inform us about what he proposes about the regeneration aspect of the Mayor's housing strategy. So we would actually like the GLA to consider extending the deadline for the consultation beyond the 7th. You asked us to comment on family-sized homes as well. Let me just do that while I'm at it.
Please do.
We think that family-sized homes should be a priority and that targets should be stated in the strategy. Because studies show that if you build family-sized homes, that actually frees up homes, smaller homes, further down the line. And there are plenty of households in London who are in overcrowded housing where 2 and 3 generations, against their will, are forced to live in the same houses in certain parts of London. So please, family-sized homes, let's make that a priority. 2 further points, and then I'll be finished.
We are running a little bit out of time.
I promise you I haven't spoken for very long. One is publicly owned land. We would like all publicly owned land, including Transport for London land, to be exclusively used for publicly owned housing. We think that's a reasonable request. And the final point is about tenant and resident engagement. We think that tenants and residents should be a valued partner and much higher up the list of partners for the GLA in discussing questions like housing. Grenfell Towers mentioned in the document, that's one case where tenants and residents were ignored and it had dreadful, disastrous consequences. We would like the Mayor to encourage boroughs to re-establish their tenants forums, and we'd like him himself to re-establish the Mayor's Housing Forum. We've actually put quite a detailed proposal in about how that forum could look, which would include tenants, community representatives and so on. You see, at the moment you've got the Homes for Londoners Board, and it includes councils, housing associations, Transport for London, the development industry, but it's not got Londoners on it in the sense of tenants, residents and community representatives. So please, those are our requests. Maybe that covers everything.
Thank you very much.
As usual, Turnbull, you're very, very comprehensive. Can I just ask you one thing? Does the London Tenants Federation therefore believe that regeneration schemes should have a binding vote of residents as a part of the consultation process?
Yes.
Can I also ask Mr. Hackett about how we make densification attractive to residents?
I think key to successful densification is design. So we need to look at high quality design and placemaking. If we're involving family housing within high density schemes, we need to, it becomes even more important to get the amenity, the public space right. I think it's not all about tall buildings. It can be about mansion blocks. It can be about townhouses. We can try and mirror the density of some of London's higher density areas like Islington and achieve quite high densities by smart, humane scale design. I think in terms of access to transport, access to facilities, having higher density schemes that are well located is incredibly important, or providing infrastructure to opportunity areas where we want to provide more high density housing. But I think another really important feature of making these schemes work is the long-term management and maintenance. That's often the bit that people forget when they're designing these schemes, that if people are going to live in a high-density environment and those buildings are going to be great places to live into the future, we need to think about the services, the mechanical and electrical, the acoustic and visual privacy. All of these factors come together to make a livable scheme. So I think it's where housing associations can actually play a really important role, because we are long-term investors. We have a long-term stake in these schemes, and we have to manage them into the future. So it's very, very important to us that we get those design features right. I think another thing is ensuring that we engage effectively with the community, because densifying areas where perhaps there's been less dense development previously, we need to make sure that people understand the benefits of these schemes, whether it's the provision of more affordable housing or the provision of other amenity that comes with some of these schemes. So design, long-term management and making sure their quality build is all critically important. And we've got some good examples of G15 associations that have built family housing at density, which has worked well.
To take up Ms Turnbull's point earlier, which I've heard on many occasions, sometimes developments, regeneration, the residents don't feel it's for them.
Yeah.
How do you make it feel as though the residents are going to benefit from those regenerations?
Well, I think if it's regeneration projects, I think consultation and engagement is absolutely key. The regeneration is about working with a community to improve the physical environment and also to provide better opportunities, whether it's jobs, training and other facilities, so that people buy into that vision of the future. We've been involved in regeneration schemes over decades, which have provided thousands of new homes and have created opportunities for people, addressed overcrowding. That can be a very big issue if you're regenerating estates where there's perhaps very poor existing physical conditions and there's poor housing in terms of the use of those dwellings being overcrowded. In terms of leaseholders, making sure people can transfer the value of their home as equity into the new development. All of these features are absolutely key to getting buy-in.
Bearing in mind you spend a lot of time on talking and engaging with residents, don't you think it's therefore reasonable that there should be a binding referendum of residents before regeneration goes ahead?
There are, with stock transfer, which often enables regeneration to happen, there's stock transfer. There's a ballot.
Has to ballot.
There is a ballot.
But in terms of
exactly.
regeneration,
But with regeneration generally, there is no requirement to ballot at the moment.
But don't you think it's a reasonable thing if you spend so much time consulting, as you've said, and that's the essential part of densification, is that we need to keep the residents on side, and if we spent a lot of time consulting, surely binding referendum would be reasonable.
I think the question is about providing homes for people who are unhoused as well as people on those estates. It can be sometimes taking account of the bigger picture, the needs of the whole community can be important. I've worked on regeneration projects where there have been ballots, they've been very successful. I've worked on other regeneration projects where there's not been a ballot, and those have turned out to be great projects as well. So I think I wouldn't want to make an absolutist point on ballots.
I was trying to get you to an absolutist point, but I won't push any further. Mr. Blyth, you heard about the advantages of co-locations, for example, building above shops and schools and things like that. Are there any disadvantages in that approach?
Well, I was thinking of my role as a school governor, which isn't strictly speaking anything to do with the RTPI, but it makes me wonder how you could guarantee continuity of service. So if a school is going to be reconstructed with homes above it, you have to build somewhere. The school has to be built first, because the school needs to continue to function. That may be slightly different with some of the uses that you can go over, but certainly, telling a primary school that it's closing and the alternative is sort of 2 postcodes away is going to completely disrupt the whole point of having a school in that place. So there has to be a way of making sure that you can keep the co-located service functioning. Where the whole thing is entirely new, it's a lot easier to do, and there's, say somewhere like Barking Riverside where we're creating new communities, then build a health centre with houses on top, flats on top, because it's all fresh is a much easier way of doing it than trying to do it with an existing service. And it seems to me that when we're looking at these we talked about large projects, when we looked at the large projects, let's make sure that we don't have single-storey buildings providing public services, which then, that land is then kind of stuck in single-storey use for the next generation.
Very much. Mr. Mortimer, you did mention co-location as well.
I think that Richard's absolutely right. If it's a new build and you're factoring it in from the beginning, it's very, very easy. There's lots of other people arguing that, there was a report out, I think, last week about building above railway lines. We've got 1,100 kilometres of railway lines, and there was some research, and engineers are saying it's all very doable and it's not so expensive. I think possibly they are right, but in terms of the housing strategy for London, we need a balance. We could spend billions into trying to build 12-storey blocks above railway lines and all the rest of it. I think it needs a common sense approach, a diverse number of approaches to meeting the housing crisis. And yes, co-location, I'm sure, does have a role.
So we've got just two examples of co-location that work very well. Metropolitan Housing Trust, one of the G15, have been involved in building the Telford Scott School in Lambeth with 36 flats above that new build primary school. We at Optivo have been involved in a scheme at Royal Arsenal, providing a retirement housing scheme above rail lines. So there are examples of doing this, there are engineering solutions, and we think that land...
I welcome those examples. It's we know about the advantages. I'm just wondering about what the pitfalls are, because it's... I think London First came out with a policy, but almost a year ago now, it may have been, where they were suggesting building above shops in London, for example.
And there are engineering challenges, obviously. I think that's one of the key issues. Then you've got traffic impact and other issues, noise and so on from co-location.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
David, would you like to wrap up this section?
Sure, fine.
We're okay for another 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, just wrap up with a final general question. Is there one key change that you think the Mayor should make to his housing strategy, and is there anything really that stands out that's missing from the strategy? So maybe I'll just go along the panel and you can all answer that question. So Paul, what's easy?
We're very, very supportive of the strategy. We think it's a great strategy. In terms of the affordable housing, thinking into the future, perhaps a London living rent product that could be a perpetuity rented product might be quite a good idea. If you could add that into the mix, that would be quite nice, because you've got people who are on lower incomes for whom an occupation may not be such a solution. But it's a very flexible model at the moment, the London living rent model, but I'd like to see potentially even more flexibility added in. The other thing, of course, is the strategy was produced before the strategic housing needs assessment suggested that the actual numbers are much higher at 66,000. So the funding that the Mayor has, the 3.15 billion, I think gets us to where we need to get to with our 90,000 homes of affordable housing. But if you start factoring up the model which we rely upon, which is a cross-subsidy model, because the grant levels are still quite low, so we're generating money from market sale and cross-subsidy from shared ownership, to get to the next level step change. I think we do need more capital grants in there. I think that would have to be at a higher unit grant rate to accommodate a product like a London living rent that was a perpetuity product.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Richard.
It's a bit of a kind of cop-out to your question, but my answer would be the combined housing strategy and London plan needs to take much more account of London's relationships with the surrounding counties. So I think we have 750,000 people entering London every day to work and 250,000 people leaving. It's not actually mentioned at all in the housing strategy, but actually under the current London plan, I believe there's a shortfall of 7,000 units per year theoretically exported to the home counties, but it doesn't actually happen that way because they're not actually accounted for in the home counties either. They just sort of disappear into the ether. So I'm aware that the previous Mayor and this Mayor have set up structures to discuss matters with the home counties, but this really does need to be taken to a new level, particularly when you think of, for example, things like Crossrail 2 and TfL and the interplay between TfL and Network Rail, sort of how people travel to work into London's labour market is really kind of part of the housing strategy.
Would that be including things that are close by, like Weybridge, and also places further away, like Brighton and Cambridge? Are you talking about generally sort of going out 50, 100 miles, or just sort of areas within the M25?
Well, the immediately surrounding counties are sort of Surrey, Hertfordshire, Essex, Berkshire, Kent. So that's quite a lot to be going on with in terms of establishing relationships and moving towards new structures. But I mean, you're technically right that there is an element of commuting from even further afield, and actually things like the new Thames link are kind of specifically designed to make that possible. So how does that actually interplay with London's housing policy, and what is the housing policy of the counties round about, which are far less well equipped to have something like a housing strategy? I mean, if this existed in Surrey, it'd be fantastic. The mayor's powers bring him in a position which is very much first among non-equals on that position, but there's always kind of interplay. People cross these boundaries every day. They don't, obey where we happen to put the boundaries of the GLA.
Thank you. Yeah,
Is that an argument for redrawing the boundary?
Wow. That goes above my pay grade.
It goes above all committee today.
Move on quickly.
Off the mayor.
Quickly, it would be to continue to champion the potential of small and medium-sized builders in London and opening up small sites, seeing through the revolving fund and presumption in favour of small sites. Probably looking towards establishing a small developers forum across London or across a number of boroughs to basically bringing boroughs, policymakers, planners, political leaders into regular contact with developers and small builders. I think the insights coming out of that could help, really inform innovative policies like the Small Sites, Small Builders programme. Perhaps there's potential for creating opportunities of a number of small developers engaging together into consortiums to build larger sites. And really looking at the opportunities for custom and self-build, where an element of genuinely affordable housing could be incorporated into those projects.
Thank you. And Pat?
Well, the problem with the policy as it is at the moment is that councils and builders and developers and housing associations can all meet the demands of this strategy without building any significant amount of housing that is actually going to solve London's housing crisis and meet the needs of a great number of Londoners, probably more than half. And unless you stop talking about affordable housing and actually start to talk about building houses that Londoners can afford to live in, the 3.15 billion is going to be wasted, and that's public money, and that would be a terrible shame.
So you've got more houses that are genuinely affordable.
Yes, let's say public housing, social rented housing.
Yeah.
That's the kind of housing we need.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, well, that is the end of this part of the meeting. Thank you very, very much for all of that. You've given us some questions we can now ask of the Deputy Mayor. The webcast is going to stay on while we swap sides, so don't relax. I think we should restart. Thank you to James Murray, the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development, and James Clark, who is the Senior Manager for Housing Strategy in the Housing and Land Department. So you're the people responsible for the housing strategy that we're looking at today. I think you saw that we have quite a lot of interesting questions that have come up during the first part of the session. We all already have questions written down. There was one thing I wanted to bring up, which has been raised in the beginning of the session as well, which we've all been discussing, is that we're going to find it very hard to judge this housing strategy if we don't have the strategic housing market assessment and the statement of need, and particularly the breakdown of need between, like as we heard, different tenures, between different sizes of homes. The detail of that hasn't been put out yet. There was a press release from the Mayor with the big numbers, but not these breakdowns where we can check if you're working and see if it's going to be delivered. Because obviously the housing strategy is aiming to build a lot of homes, but if we can't assess the balance and the way that it focuses on different things, we're going to have trouble. So I wanted to, and also we were reminded by Pat Turnbull from the Tenants Federation that we still don't have the good practice guide to regeneration either. So I think possibly we might want to start by asking you, when will we see the strategic housing market assessment, and would you go along with the idea that we might want to see an extension to the consultation on the housing strategy so that we have more time to look at the two documents together? That is going to come out alongside the London Plan, as I understand it.
So I think, firstly, thank you for having me along here today. I mean, I suppose to set up my way of seeing how the different documents and strategies the GLA produces work together, the housing strategy, is very much kind of hand in hand with the London Plan, and they very much operate in a linked way. So the housing strategy in some ways goes beyond the London Plan, in that it's not just the planning tools, it also references in more detail funding, interventions in terms of the land market, different sorts of builders, broader beyond just building into private renting and homelessness and rough sleeping and so on. And likewise, the London Plan goes beyond just housing, in that it balances it with industrial use and transport and infrastructure and all the other land uses that you need in London. So the two are kind of overlap around housing, but they do act very much kind of hand in hand. In terms of the strategic housing market assessment, I mean, that will be published either ahead of or at the same time as the draft London Plan, so it'll be there as part of the evidence base published for the London Plan. And the way that works is that the assessment is done strictly on the basis of, as you rightly say, of need, of what in theory you would need in order to keep up with London's growing population and to meet the backlog of demand in terms of size of units, tenure breakdown and so on. And then the response of the London Plan is to say how can we go as far as possible toward meeting that need in the policies and the capacity we identify in the London Plan. So as you referred to the Mayor's announcement recently, the strategic housing market assessment is going to show a need for around 66,000 homes, and the capacity identified in the London Plan will be about 65,000, so pretty much meeting it, which is quite a considerable stretch to identify that much capacity in London. But yeah, the strategic housing market assessment will be out in all its detail for you to see as part of the London Plan coming out. I mean, I also think that the draft London housing strategy is obviously a snapshot at that point in time, and things are going to evolve. And so I think with the estate regeneration good practice guide being a key example of a document where that will again operate in conjunction with the London housing strategy. So the way that we designed it was to make sure the housing strategy says the Mayor will expect the principles in his good practice guide to be followed, which then means that we can publish and discuss the good practice guide itself, just for the precise policies in relation to estate regeneration. So I don't think I think in a way you can have the housing strategy and everything in the housing strategy the housing strategy doesn't have to cover the detail of all the other policies in, for instance, the Good Practice Guide to Estate Regeneration or the London Plan, but it has to clearly identify how it links. So if the London Housing Strategy says, this is what we're setting out in the housing strategy, but for more detail on this, see the Good Practice Guide to Estate Regeneration or see the London Plan or whatever other documents you want to signpost toward, it kind of operates as a network of documents in that way.
I think the way we would look at it, though, is that the housing strategy, because as you've identified, it includes funding, it includes mechanisms of delivery, like things like land assembly. In what you've just been saying, it would be the overarching document. It would be the document that sits on top, and then the other things are part of that. It goes further than the London Plan, so you would think because we're trying to judge whether or not the Mayor's strategy can deliver, we would need the strategic needs assessment at the point at which we're assessing the strategy rather than the London plan.
I suppose there's sort of 2 points you're making there, but I mean, on what I think the main question was around how the strategy links to other documents. I mean, you said, for instance, the housing strategy refers to funding, and that's right, it does. But it clearly points you towards the Affordable Housing Programme prospectus for greater detail on how that funding is spent. And likewise, if we were to get more funding in the budget or in a spring statement next year, we wouldn't necessarily have to update the housing strategy every time more money might come in from government, but we would update the funding prospectus relevant to that money. So again, it's back to my sort of central point around the housing strategy signposting towards other documents where relevant. So in terms of the funding, rather than updating the housing strategy per se every time new funding might come in or decisions about funding are taken, that's why we have an Affordable Homes Programme funding prospectus specifically around how funding is allocated, which is signposted from the housing strategy.
Yeah, but my point is, if we're going to assess whether the housing strategy works, we're going to need to know what the need is at the point at which we look at the housing strategy.
I mean, the strategic housing market assessment, as I say, will be out at the same time as the London plan, which will be very soon, and that will be in the public domain for you to see.
Is there any impediment to publishing it earlier?
Is there any? Because you've already released. Go on, Andrew.
My question is that you've already put summaries in the public domain, therefore it exists in some form. The press release that was issued by the Mayor says the new figures of housing need calculated by City Hall through their strategic housing market assessment also suggest that 65% of these new homes would need to be affordable. So it exists. It's there. Why haven't we seen it?
I'm very happy to go back and check with planning colleagues and get you an update on when that will be published.
Well, it's all. If you're going to refer to it, if you're going to put a figure in the public domain that you get from the strategic housing market assessment, we should see it. The Assembly should see it. Should see what informs that statement that the Mayor's office themselves have put in the public domain. We haven't, stolen that. That was in a press release. So we should see that data. That's the point.
Did you want to add something?
Well, I just wanted to back that up as well. And I mean, we know that the London plan is now in its sort of, just about to be completely published, so it's finished and all the rest of it. So I can't see why we can't see that. But the other point, I don't understand if you're talking about, them going hand in hand, why it's not available now. And the other point is, and Tom knows because I've been saying to him, where is the estate's good practice guide? I mean, the consultation on that was ages and ages ago. I was absolutely 100% expecting it to come out at the time when the housing strategy came out. Surely the estate's good practice guide also goes hand in hand with the housing strategy, which has now been out since the beginning of September. And I just don't understand why that isn't there. It just makes no sense to me at all. And I'm very glad that Pat raised it, because I've been talking about it for weeks as well.
It is true, James, that it's you talked about it being a network of documents, but it's very hard if we can't do our work if we don't see the network. And I'm just wondering, there's also the SHLA. I know the SHMA and the SHMA, Strategic Housing Market Assessment, Strategic Housing Land Assessment, are the evidence base for the London Plan. But it would be, and therefore they do traditionally come out actually alongside the London Plan. But it would in this case be very helpful because of the housing strategy coming out virtually at the same time and us having a closing date which is just after the London Plan's published, giving us no time to absorb the SHMA and the SHMA. It would be very useful if we could see it like now.
I think our question is really, can we either see those documents now or can we feed back on the strategy a little bit later to give us more time to digest those documents?
Oh, that would be another way of doing it, yes.
As I say, we'll go away and talk to planning colleagues around the publication of that and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, that doesn't. Yeah. Nikki cut it. I wanted an answer to my question about.
Sorry,
the estate,
I didn't include that. I meant to include
the estate regeneration guide. Where is it? Because surely that really goes hand in hand with the house.
Also, the SHLA, by the way.
Okay, so we're after the SHLA and the estate regeneration guide, please.
So just Leonie's question, so make sure I don't keep missing that. So consulting on the Estate Regeneration Good Practice Guide, there was a big response to it, as you rightly mentioned, as there should be, and as is good, to have that many responses. Being very honest, after what happened in June at Grenfell, we got more people coming forward with their opinions, and we wanted to take time to process what people were saying. We're collecting together all the responses at the moment, going through the consultation responses, and it'll be out soon. I would like to be able to give you an exact date, but it will be out soon.
That could mean, very soon, or next week soon, or next month soon. I think it's really important, if we're trying to reply to the housing strategy by the 7th of December, that we definitely know we're going to see it before that, for example. I do think, the Estates Good Practice Guide is absolutely critical for the Housing Committee to be able to take an overall position on the draft housing strategy. I would like to be able to respond to both documents together. Estate regeneration affects just as many Londoners as all the other issues to do with new build sites. For me, I want to be able to respond on those both at the same time.
I agree.
So can we ask you, I know you probably can't just say right out yes, but can you commit to going away and looking at those 3 documents that we've asked for and getting back to us, either to say you'll release them or give us an extension?
If I just make 2 points, hopefully to bring this part of the discussion, to give way forward on this part of the discussion, which is that, on the Estate Regeneration Good Practice Guide, as part of the consultation, we have heard from many people around this table already in terms of your feedback on that. So in terms of you having an opportunity to consider the principles for Estate Regeneration Good Practice Guide, we have heard, we've had meetings, I sat down with Sean, we've gone through it in quite a lot of detail together, with detailed views on it already, so that has fed in very directly to the consultation process. So I think I would like to underline that the consultation on that has included an opportunity for everyone around this table to feed in. And on the broader point around the timings of the Schlar and the Schlar and so on, can I suggest I get back to you in detail on the timings of that and the way that's suggested?
Okay, thank you. We should probably now move on to the questions about the strategy itself. Thank you. Tom Copley, you want to begin?
Although I did have one quick question in advance of that, which
following on from...
It follows on from what Pat was saying about tenants on the Homes for Londoners board, and this is something I've raised with the Mayor before. Why not include a tenant's voice on the Homes for Londoners board?
So the specific reason why the Homes for Londoners board was set up as it was to talk about the sort of delivery models for new homes, and to make sure that people who are actually going to be doing the actual construction and the building of the homes were coming together to feed back to the Mayor on a regular basis. I think the flexibility we built into the structure was to have subgroups around particular topics, particular areas. So if there were a subgroup, for instance, around particularly tenant involvement or something along those lines, that would then be an opportunity for tenants and their representatives to be involved in the work of that subgroup. And actually what we found in practice over the last year, 18 months, is that the subgroups is where a lot of the real work, the detailed thinking has been done, and that's actually where a lot of the most interesting outputs of the board have come from. I'm not saying the board meetings themselves aren't interesting, but I think a lot of the really interesting outputs for more wider consumption have come from the subgroups and their research and the kind of people they've been able to draw together. So it has that flexibility built into it to draw in people from lots of different backgrounds. So, for instance, when they were looking at the various issues around new models of home building, that was able to draw in all different sorts of people to that group, not just the people on the board, people from a much wider set of backgrounds. So I think there is that flexibility built into it, hopefully to allow people to be involved when the subject matter at hand is relevant to them.
Have any tenants been involved, has groups been involved thus far with the subgroups?
So I haven't got a list in front of me, but one example that springs to mind is the subgroup that Hugh Bullock chaired, which looked at the impact of overseas buyers on the housing market in London, and I'm not sure if you'd call them tenants groups, but that had representation from probably others, but definitely Shelter, definitely Priced Out were on there. As kind of lobby groups on behalf of tenants, and I think there are others as well, but we can write to you with a full list.
I won't take any more time because I want to get to the strategy, but that would be helpful, thank you. So, my actual question, what impact will higher interest rates have on London's housing market?
It's a nice easy question to kick this off. I think I think in terms of people buying new homes, people who are homeowners already, people have gotten very used to mortgage rates being at historic lows, and we've obviously seen a small rise for the first time in 10 years in that rate. Obviously the level we're talking about now is quite an early stage to work out what impact that might have, and we have regular meetings with the Council of Mortgage Lenders and with other people offering mortgages to make sure we're keeping ahead of or alongside developments in the mortgage market and so on. And I think there's also a question around the cost of finance for development, so not just in terms of people getting mortgages. There's a question around at what rates can people get investment into home building, and obviously going through public borrowing usually gives you a lower rate in most circumstances, and so that can be a good way to invest extra money. I think one of the issues that you can see in terms of housing associations, for instance, is as their rating might change as they can have access to different sources of finance. That might impact on their overall capacity that they can borrow. So I mean, it depends what the setup is for that housing association, what impact that would have. I think it's quite difficult to give you a single answer saying this increase would give this outcome, just because it's also tied up in the different ways that people acquire money, but borrow money to invest. But I'm not sure we have a specific thing in mind.
Do you think it hits sort of? I'm particularly interested in terms of housing delivery, and whether this hits confidence and therefore makes it likely we're going to see fewer homes being built by developers. Essentially, is that? Do you worry that is going to happen as a result of this increase?
I would think there are significant other challenges, to be honest, in terms of the driving the delivery model forward.
Not top of your list.
I mean, if you look at, for instance, in a nutshell, what's happened over the last few years, you've had a situation where most new build in London is driven by fairly expensive for sale homes. So most of it's driven by that kind of for sale product where it's at high prices, where it's unaffordable to most Londoners. The house price sort of flatlining, particularly amongst the kind of the wobble amongst house prices, particularly for the high-end properties, which kind of started, I guess, 2015. The impact on house prices there feeds in very quickly to new starts because it's a model so heavily dependent on what you get from for sale properties. So that kind of dynamic is actually a really significant dynamic impacting on the level of starts that we've inherited over the next, in the pipeline coming forward now, which is why, as the housing strategy sets out, a move toward other models of delivery, whether it's more affordable housing out of London where the prices are slightly more affordable in general, or long-term rented housing, why those are more sustainable sources of supply. So I sort of think in terms of the kind of first order questions around what are the concerns around making sure that we can boost supply, that shift away from a model which is very reliant on the high end for sale housing, which is impacted by the house price changes since 2015, that would have a big impact. I think that would be one of my first order concerns. Okay. James, do you want to add anything specifically about?
I'm sorry, I was just exchanging a note. Sorry, I didn't hear the end of that because I was, yeah.
No, I mean, just finally on this point, whether it will have an impact on, for example, a lot of council developments, for example, whether it's regeneration or not, are using models of cross subsidy with private for sale. Do you think it could impact on that?
But again, I think that, in my mind, and James might want to come in here, but that would come back more to the house prices, because people are so reliant on that cross subsidy from for sale homes. So it's the sort of primary driver there for me would be concern about a model which is very heavily reliant on high house prices, even to deliver the affordable housing via cross subsidy. And actually, if you're moving to a situation where you're more reliant on affordable housing, which is good because you deliver more affordable housing, but also good in a kind of, even in a sort of business sense, in terms of increasing supply because it's a more stable supply, that implies a kind of different model of delivery.
Okay. Yeah, insofar as councils and housing associations are dependent on the same source of finances as general developers, then obviously they will be affected by anything that's going on in the wider economy. And I think there's a linked point here that we make in the housing strategy around access to borrowing for councils specifically, and there is a kind of ask which I think many of Assembly members have also called for in the past around removing the borrowing caps, which is the kind of surest way that local authorities can access cheap borrowing that's kind of backed by Treasury. So I think there's a kind of tangential but very important point there around the sustainability of councils investing in housing.
Would it impact on where councils will set up a company and are then essentially loaning money to the company and getting the really low rate of interest? I mean, that it might have an impact on that.
I think everyone is different, and I think it will depend how it's structured, and it could be a joint venture or it could be something different. Sometimes it's a fully owned council company, and I think it will be different in different cases.
I'll move on to my next question, which is on devolution, which a lot of the strategy, I think, does rely on the government giving you more powers. How do you assess your chances of the government giving you these powers?
Depends who's in government.
Well, I was going to say the current government, we don't know how long that's going to last for now. But
it's a bit too tempting to make jokes at this stage, sorry, I'll try and be more serious. So, I mean, I think it's really important that the housing strategy, you know, it sets up what we can do and what we want to see councils do with us, but also, you know, acknowledges even if we push all of our powers and resources to their very limit now, that wouldn't go far enough to meeting the housing need, and so therefore we need government to step in. And some of the asks of government are very precise because they're quite fairly easy ones they could do, like James said, around letting councils invest against their housing revenue accounts. Should be a no-brainer, should be done quickly. Some of it's of a bigger scale, you know, increasing the amount of investment in affordable housing, you know, substantially. The estimates, you know, we did show, you know, so I think it's, you know, it does set out quite a big ask of government, but I think there's a range of different things government could do, right from the very relatively quick and relatively easy to the much longer term fundamental changes. And, you know, we'd like to be in a position where councils are building a lot more council housing, where the GLA has stronger powers over bringing land forward, where we had a much more substantial affordable housing investment budget and so on. That's all quite a big set of changes, which are sort of flagged up in the housing strategy and in other things we've said. But I think it also includes stuff that we could do on a more incremental scale if that was the appetite from government. So there's a kind of range of what we might get from government to answer your question, from what we could see as being important but relatively incremental improvements through to real kind of game-changing different approaches.
I mean, there are things like, I mean, changing the way CPO works was, I think, something that was in the Conservative Party's manifesto. Are you seeing any progress on that? Because that's one of the key things in terms of unlocking more cheaper land to develop.
Yeah. So, I mean, CPO is a really good example of where there's a sort of fairly immediate but relatively incremental change that could be made, and then a much longer term, or not necessarily longer term, but a more larger scale ask that we would have of whoever's in government. And the most immediate thing is, you know, there were some improvements in the Neighbourhood Planning Act which haven't been implemented yet. We think they should just be implemented as quickly as possible. We also think that the whole CPO process with the tribunals and so on that do the valuations and process the CPOs should be well resourced, so it's quick and fast and certain, so it doesn't slow up development. Because what happens at the moment is, you know, the credibility or the speed of the CPO process, it can be held back by a lack of resources just in the system. So that's some kind of obvious stuff that could be done, so that if we're doing CPOs even under the current situation, they're quicker and more credible. I think going beyond that, though, clearly, you know, there are much more ambitious ways of approaching land where we could, you know, if the GLA had much stronger powers to bring forward land closer to existing use value for affordable housing, you know, that would be a real change in the approach and could really enable us to scale up delivery substantially. So that's quite a good example in terms of land assembly powers, of where there's some stuff we can do fairly immediately but fairly incrementally, and then some slightly bigger changes that could help sort of underpin a fundamentally different model of supply.
There's a bit of an anomaly, isn't there, with regards to first refusal on public land. So the HCA has it nationally, but I don't think, despite the fact that the GLA has the HCA's funding powers in London, we don't have the ability to have the first refusal. Is that something that the government are going to change?
I don't know if the government are going to change it. I know it's something we're asking the government for. I can tell you that, and this is not breaking confidences because he said it in public, in this building, in a public meeting, that when we were in a meeting, actually just the next committee room along, Gavin Barwell was here and he was housing minister, and I mentioned this very point to him in the public meeting, and he said, "Oh, I thought you guys had that power already." And so it's something which everyone clearly thinks is a no-brainer. Well, you'd hope. But we just hope the government will listen to that request.
Okay. I have the next question. It's about affordability. I think we heard Pat Turnbull earlier on asking some issues about definitions of affordable that are in there. Now, I want to separate funding and planning because those are the two different things. We've already interrogated your funding plans quite a lot in terms of the definitions of things like the London affordable rent, the London living rent as it exists within your funding plans, and then London shared ownership, which is slightly different to the national picture. But within the strategy, there are policies that lead us towards what might be in the London plan. It worries me a lot that within policy 4.1, which is your affordable homes definitions that you've laid out for planning policies, we still have the affordable homes definition for rent, which is 80% of market rates. And it sits around also in the glossary, where you've more or less reproduced the definition that's in the NPPF, National Planning Policy. In terms of devolution, obviously national planning policy exists. National planning policy's definition of affordable rent is no more than 80% of market rates. Potentially in London, we could redefine that rent ourselves in terms of a smaller amount of how it relates to the market rate. But what we really want is to redefine it in terms of wages, which is what the Mayor's done with the London living rent definitions that he's put out. To what extent do you think it might be possible for the London plan to remove that 80% of market rate definition? Because arguably, when you have 80% of market rate rents, they're not affordable homes.
I mean, the Mayor's been very clear that he thinks that 80% of market rent is not genuinely affordable.
And he says so in the strategy, and yet it's still there.
Well, I suppose I wouldn't want to get too distracted by the glossary, because the glossary just includes definitions of terms, and it is a fact that affordable rent is defined nationally as up to 80% of market rent. Something being in the glossary doesn't mean you're endorsing it, it's just explaining to people what that term means generally. So I think it's quite important that it's on record that something being in the glossary is not an endorsement of the Mayor's stance on a position. No, it is important, because if you're sort of implying that by it being in the glossary somehow we're taking a different view on that than is in fact the case, it's worth my correcting that in this forum. What the Mayor's very clear about is that his definition of London affordable rent, which is something which can be funded from within the affordable rent programme, which was a condition obviously of getting money through the £3.15 billion. London affordable rent, in order to get the funding from those particular homes, they would need to be let at benchmarks based on social rent levels. So it's called London affordable rent, and the terminology London affordable rent, which I hope is in the glossary as well. Yes, it is, yeah. So you can have a look at that, just to confirm it's in there for you as well. That says that rents must be based on social rent levels, because although I take your point around linking rents to incomes, and that's what we've done with the London living rent, I'm not sure I agree with you that we should abandon social rent, because I think that people actually have quite a lot of trust in social rent. And to this point around what is genuinely affordable, I think if you say to people these are at social rent levels, these are based on social rent levels which people broadly speaking know and broadly speaking trust, I think that's quite important. So I would hesitate from going down your line of abandoning social rent.
No, that's not exactly what I was asking at all.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood.
I'm asking, this definition that's in there of 80% affordable rent, it is 80% of market rates, is there. Why aren't we trying to redefine that for London? As why don't we redefine what the maximum intermediate rent can be? I mean, the policy 4.1 Part B number 2 does say a range of other types of intermediate rented homes, and that's towards a planning policy. That's what developers can provide.
Intermediate rented, so that would be intermediate rented, as in that's not within the category of general needs rent. So that's different. So when you're doing, in terms of whether it's planning policy and the way the funding feeds into that, you've got general needs rent, which is usually social rent or affordable rent, and in our case, London affordable rent, which is homes based on social rent levels. So you kind of end up at pretty much the same place, just via slightly different terminology. And then you've got intermediate housing, which will include both intermediate rent and forms of low-cost home ownership, mostly shared ownership. So that would be the way they would split up.
Yeah. And intermediate rent is the thing I'm asking about. How is London going to define intermediate rent and the maximum rent that it can be to still count as affordable?
Well, we see London living rent as being what the Mayor would like to aim for in as many cases as possible. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's something which is still feeding through, I think, in terms of different boroughs' approaches to what they consider to be different levels of discount to make it affordable, particularly in build-to-rent schemes, for instance, where some boroughs are requesting a range of different discounts rather than all at one, and sometimes the depth of discount impacts on the quantity of affordable housing. So some boroughs would prioritise having slightly fewer affordable homes, but much more genuinely affordable, and others will like it to be a less of a discount to market, but have more of it. And often that can depend on what the actual market rate is in an area, because if the market rate is not too high, then maybe a more shallow discount might make it more affordable to people on average incomes, and so you want more of it. Whereas in areas where it's very expensive in the market, you might want a heavy discount to make it genuinely affordable.
So you're still saying that it's going to be a discount based on market rates and not related to wages at the maximum?
What the Mayor wants to move toward is to have intermediate rents based on London living rents, which are indexed, as you know, on local incomes. And so that's the kind of direction that he wants to go in. But yeah, we have a national planning policy and we operate within that. We're trying to steer it towards products that we think are genuinely affordable.
And you think that there's options that boroughs might have that'll still be able to go up to 80% and still be counted as affordable in some cases? That will still be the ceiling.
Under national planning policy, homes can be, the definition nationally of affordable housing is the 80%.
And you're not going to try and lower that for London as part of your devolution outside. I think you could go and make the case to an inspector as part of the London plan process, but I think ultimately you'd be better off getting the okay from government to have a lower definition, a lower maximum.
Well, I think we've been very clear in the housing strategy where we're saying that for London affordable rent, for general needs housing, London affordable rent should be based on social rent levels, and I think that's very clear.
You're going back to the beginning of the question again, though, aren't you? The maximum that the boroughs can do when they're allowing for discounts, you still leave that maximum at 80 based on national planning policy, which is why it's in the glossary.
Yes,
can I?
Just
think Nikki might want to follow up on something.
I think we need to be really clear on the distinction between general needs housing and intermediate housing, and the Mayor's statements about 80% of market rents and affordable rent are in relation to general needs housing. Mm-hmm. And there is a kind of imperative on us to follow national planning guidance when it comes to things like definitions of affordable homes, which is why we've used those definitions in the glossary. Okay, we'll go into that further. Nikki, would you like to...
Yes, it's just that this has made me think. I want to just talk about the SHMA for a moment. That's the Strategic Housing Market Assessment, because that's how you get your need figure. But when in the previous SHMA, when the government brought in the affordable rent category, social rent was subsumed into that, and it was quite difficult to unpick in the previous SHMA what the different categories of need were. Can you just explain to us how you work? I mean, is the SHMA dictating how you categorise housing need? I mean, are we going to see the need for social rented homes separate from the need for the London living rent?
My understanding is that it will set out the different needs for low-cost rent, i.e. general needs rent, versus intermediate housing, which is mostly intermediate rent or intermediate home ownership, that will be separated out. So there wouldn't be a single figure for affordable housing in the needs assessment. It would break it down into the two different principal groups of sort of more general needs housing versus intermediate housing.
So it's following the government's guidelines?
Yes, again,
so it doesn't help us to interpret it from the London perspective. We're looking at what the SHMA will break it down in a way which follows the government's guidelines. Am I right?
So the National Planning Policy Framework tells us how to assess housing needs, and
Right.
it tells us we have to break the need down by intermediate and general needs, which is what we'll do.
Yeah.
But one thing we also want to do in the new assessment is try and dig into, at each income bracket, what can people afford, to get away from this issue of definitions. But
Will the
fundamentally,
Schmar, have you done that for the Schmar?
that is what we're doing at the moment, so that's why it's not, it's happening now.
It's happening now. Oh, that's interesting. And will that be published when the Schmar's published?
The Schmar will be published, as James said, alongside the London Plan, so all of that will be published. Everything we've done to support the Schmar will be published at the same time as the London Plan, or shortly before. I think it's around.
So alongside the Schmar, we will be getting this much more fine-grained breakdown.
No, the Schmar will follow the national guidance that we have to follow.
Sure, I get that, but you're going to do some other work alongside it.
Well, no, I think what we're trying to make the point in the Schmar, we have to decide a cut-off for the general needs and the intermediate, and the Schmar, when it's published, will define where that cut-off is. I'm not going to tell you today exactly what's in the Schmar, because I don't have it in front of me, but it will be published shortly, I think, before the London Plan.
Cooper wanted to come in.
So I think the thing that we're sort of dancing around is that we started talking about the devolution asks, and what I'm not clear about, because you've now started referring back to the National Planning Policy Framework, are you actually specifically asking for some sort of power that allows us to alter the way that we operate under that overall umbrella in London, because of the nature and the scale of the housing crisis? And I think the figures that Pat gave in terms of, I know you don't want to talk about it in terms of income, but for me that is one of the stark things, that if someone is on a salary of 17 grand, a number of the products that we're talking about actually just won't be really affordable. I was talking to my goddaughter who lives in Glasgow. She shares a 2-bedroom flat with 2 others, so a couple and her. They individually pay £41 per week as their rent. Now, I don't think there's anywhere at all in the whole of London where, you know, and she's on a basic income, 0 hours contract, and so on and so forth. You know, are we actually going to be able to get some sort of permission to enable us in London to effectively meet people's housing needs?
Okay. I mean, just two points I think you brought up there. I mean, firstly, on the point around whether we want to talk about affordability in terms of income, I mean, we are very clear in terms of income levels when we're defining the London living rent, for instance, as an intermediate product, and that's what we want to go toward, is making sure that's, you know, affordable to people on average incomes. And the point I was trying to make to Sian, and apologies if there's misunderstanding in my response, but I don't think for social rent, or for whatever we build to help people who normally would have accessed social rent, I don't think moving towards an income-based way of calculating the rent there is necessarily what would give people confidence, because I think people know what social rent is, and having something based on a social rent level is quite an I think we must have misunderstood what you were suggesting there. So I think what I think we're agreeing on, as far as I can tell, is that we have social rent, or via the slightly convoluted route, London affordable rent based on social rent levels, which effectively comes out around the same thing, where it's something people can have confidence in is genuinely affordable, you know, very low cost rent for people on low incomes, social rent levels, and so on. And then for the intermediate rent, where you know, up until now it's always been done as a discount to market. If we're saying the intermediate rents should be based on average earnings, that's a new way of looking at it. So I hope that, and I think Sian and I agree on that. I think
should be is great.
Yeah.
But what the limit cap is the question.
Sorry.
I think. Yeah.
I think the other point that you asked about was about devolution from government, and certainly, I mean, we've been having discussions with a number of different people in government, as has the people of...
It's a revolving door policy that they have in this area.
It's an ongoing process, and part of that discussion has been, you know, at various points, has been around how do we make sure we can set the right planning policy for London. It would be probably not the right thing for me to do to give a running commentary of where we're at right now in terms of discussion, but
that expression before.
but I can definitely tell you, right. But I can definitely tell you that, you know, I have mentioned that point in the past around London having its own planning policy, not subject to the national thing. I'm not sure what we're going to get, when we might get it, but it's in there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, it was a similar point to Assembly-member Cooper's. I mean, I was in Hull the other week, and they were telling me that 80% of market rent in Hull is less than social rent, and that they've only just recently been able to start building market sale houses, because until recently they've cost more to build than to sell. So it's absurd that we have to comply with the same planning policy that they do. But on the just on the subject again of the affordable rent and the discounts, is there I think what you're saying is you have to have this in there because you have to comply. But even if you were to build, say, 65% or 70% of market rent in an area, let's say, was deemed to be affordable, but a few years later the area is regenerated, the values go up, suddenly it might not be deemed affordable anymore. Is there any way to prevent that from happening, or is it all going to be locked in at, say, 75% of market rent in perpetuity?
I mean, that's one advantage with our London affordable rent definition, because they're based on the social rent benchmark.
If the borough comes to you and says we want to do this differently because you're in the strategy, they have the flexibility to do things differently. They don't have to. I know the stuff you're funding is all according to what the mayor set out, but they can come to you with something else, can't they?
We can have a discussion with a borough if they have a particular proposition, but in general, we think that London affordable rent is defined as being as expected to be at social rent levels, and that's on benchmarks set out numerically in the document. So it can't reset the market rate and then reappraise it. It's set out there in black and white.
But if they're negotiating with a developer on Section 106, they could come up with something else, couldn't they? Or have I misunderstood what?
Well, it depends it depends what size of scheme it is and when exactly that negotiation happens, as in, has the new London plan come out, have they adopted it in the local plan, is it referable here, and so on. So there's quite a lot of variables around there. But I think, the fundamental point around giving people confidence in London affordable rent is to say we expect it to be based on social rent benchmarks, which, as I say, are set out numerically. It's £153 a week for a 2-bed flat. It's in there.
Can I just, is the general needs that you were talking about, Martin, is that the London affordable rent in the SHMAR?
General needs includes London affordable rent and social rent.
Okay. That's all. That's
okay, we maybe should move on to the next question. This has been a very good discussion. I think we are going to feed back as a committee on your housing strategy, and potentially we'll talk then a bit more about intermediate rent definitions, but we'll get that. Assemblymember Curtin, you have the next question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hi, good afternoon. The strategy makes only a passing mention of a number of groups, such as older people and students, and it doesn't appear to make any mention of the hidden homeless, which is something we've been investigating and talking about over the last few sessions. Where's the proof that you are listening to these groups of people for your housing strategy?
No, and I think and the Assembly did a report on hidden homelessness, which raised a number of important points, some of which align with where we want to go in the housing strategy, some of which we'll make sure we look at when we're bringing out the final version of the housing strategy to see if we need to make clearer or strengthen any or amend any points. So appreciate the findings of that report. I think particularly in terms of the section in the housing strategy around homelessness and rough sleeping, it's obviously it separates out very clearly homelessness in its broader sense from rough sleeping. Although rough sleeping in one sense is the sharpest end of homelessness, it's a very particular set of reasons why people end up sleeping rough on the streets, and homelessness in its broader definition is a much wider problem, affecting quite often a different set of people for slightly different reasons. Affecting more families, affecting people who might be hidden homeless, as you say, rather than ending up actually sleeping rough on the street. So I think what I can reassure you is that in looking at the how to amend the draft strategy ahead of the final one coming out, we'll take all of the points in the Assembly's report into hidden homelessness into account, because I think it raises a number of important points. Because it's topical because Shelter came out with research today, as we said, highlighting that yes, you've got rough sleeping, but you've also got people who are in temporary accommodation, hostels, B&Bs and so on, and then hidden homeless as well, who often even missed off any statistics which are reported publicly. So it's important we identify people in that situation. And I think hidden homeless can be people who are working, are otherwise everything is going. They've got other things lined up in their life, but they can't get somewhere secure to live. And actually, the provision of more genuinely affordable housing to come full circle is something which will help people in that situation. So I think for homelessness in its broadest sense, there's a number of responses we can have now to try and reduce homelessness and rough sleeping, but we can't get away from the big picture here, which is it's rising private rents, the lack of genuine affordable housing, and welfare changes, which is the underlying causes of the numbers being as high as they are now.
So it's sort of part of the broader picture, because it can include just people, as you say, who are working but maybe sleeping on someone's couch because they can't get their own place. So it's sort of rough sleeping is just the tip of the iceberg for homelessness, which you rightly say. So for dealing with the hidden homeless, then it's sort of part of the broader strategy for releasing more affordable housing. Is that what you're saying?
I think I'm saying that the underlying reasons for why people are homeless, including homeless in a hidden way, is because of the fundamentals of what's wrong with the housing situation in London. Around the lack of affordable housing, insecurity in high private rents, and welfare changes. So, in our discussions, certainly with government, we're always keen to say yes, we want help to deal with the problems now and to help people find somewhere to live. But let's not forget the bigger picture here, that what we need to do over the long run to make sure these numbers decrease.
Okay. Now I did also mention in the question older people and students. Now, is there anything that you're thinking of putting into the housing strategy about those two groups of people to help them specifically as well?
I think, we can definitely take away to see if we should spell out in more detail those points. I think in the draft London plan there will be some specific points around purpose-built student accommodation for students, and what kind of housing is right for older people, trying to be clear that in some cases it might be housing where you have a degree of care associated with the housing, but in other cases it might not be. It might just be the right sort of housing for older people who are otherwise active in their life but want to downsize from what has been their family home into a smaller flat in a central area or whatever. People might have a different sort of need when they're older, but I think I definitely will take away your point around if we can strengthen or clarify or add some detail to our policies on that into the housing strategy.
There's another group of people that I'm thinking of as well, which is working class people, and as you're probably aware, because of the crisis in housing and the continual rising of prices, what you might call original Londoners, people whose families have been in London for decades, maybe centuries, working people have tended to move out from sort of Tower Hamlets to Dagenham, and a lot of people who used to live in London now live in Essex or Kent, or had to move out of London altogether. But what is there anything for these original communities of Londoners who are finding that because of pressure they're having to continually move out and might be forced out of London altogether? Have you thought about that as a group of people?
I think the primary reason I think why people who you've described are facing housing pressure is because of the unaffordability. And that's what it comes back to, and that affects the groups that you described and other people without access to wealth or on lower incomes. So actually, the point does lead us back to the central question of affordability here, which is the story of London over the last 20 years has been one where we've had real success in creating jobs, and jobs have gone up by 40% in the last 20 years. But the number of homes has only gone up by 15% over that 20-year period. So the kind of economic success, in one sense, hasn't been matched by any kind of housing success in keeping up with demand. And so the affordability pressure affects, as I said, the groups of people you described, as well as other Londoners without access to higher income or sources of wealth.
There is one issue, though, that I've become aware of from people writing to me and as an assembly member and about their situations, is that with the plans to regenerate areas around stations, particularly in outer London, there are some places Slade Green is one in particular that I've put a couple of questions in to the Mayor this month, where local residents live in a nice, stable community. There's a lot of older people. They've lived there for many years, but they're sick with worry because they tell me they've been told that a lot of houses, nice family houses in a pleasant area around the station, may face the threat of being demolished in order to densify and intensify. Now, I understand that, densification in some places will generate some new housing, and that's fine. But when there's a place where there's stable working community, older people, should that happen? I mean, is there some way of distinguishing between places like Slade Green, where there's people are happy there, they don't want their houses to be demolished, and other places where regeneration might be a good thing and happen with the consent of the local people?
So, I think, without getting into the specifics of Slade Green, particularly if that's the subject of other questions you've asked the Mayor, but I think the general point is that there is no, in a kind of London-wide scale or London-wide setting, we do need to build at greater densities than we have been doing up until now. We know the huge number of homes we need to build. We know we want to protect the green belt. We therefore do need to make sure that we're building at higher densities. And if you're going to identify where in London it makes most sense to build at higher densities, places which are near to transport links do make more sense. Because you don't need cars as much and so on if you've got greater access to public transport. So I think there's no getting away from the kind of the broad London-wide perspective here, which is that there is going to be building happening in the next few years at greater densities than people have been used to. But I think what is imperative on us as part of that is to make sure that the design of it is one that people can feel in as many cases as possible proud of, and that they like the design of the homes which is coming forward.
I would argue it's also very, very important to make sure that existing people who live there are not forced out of London or not forced away from their neighbourhood. How can people in areas like Slade Green, Chessington's another one, contact you and make their views known and get representation? Because they're very, very worried that, whether regeneration happens or not, that they'll be forced out of areas where their families have lived in for generations.
I mean, if there's specific cases people want to write in about, they should just contact, me or an officer, someone directly, and we can make sure that feeds in. I think the more general point, regeneration can take different forms depending on what the focus is. I mean, we touched briefly on estate regeneration, and the arguments there are stuff we've discussed in quite a lot of detail around making sure that people are fully consulted and involved, and you replace affordable housing and so on. I think the other point though, and again it's a slightly broader point, but I think it's important, is that if you are building new homes of greater density, you need to make sure that a substantial portion are genuinely affordable. And that's one way of giving people the confidence that this is not about lots of very expensive homes for sale coming into a local area and changing the makeup of that area with housing that doesn't necessarily help local people. If you have the housing coming in with a decent proportion of genuinely affordable housing, people might have some concerns around the density or the design or whatever issues they want to raise. But if there's a decent proportion of genuinely affordable housing, I think that helps make the case for greater building.
So, I'm really sorry, we're going to have to speed up the pace a little bit more. I think the Deputy Mayor has agreed to stay until 4:30, is that right? We still have like 5 questions to go. So please take that up in a separate... It's a good discussion, and we could undoubtedly have a long discussion about each of these questions. But we're going to have to shift, I'm afraid. Assemblymember Cooper is going to move on now to the question of land.
I am, although I'm interested to find if there's any community anywhere that's keen to have their housing demolished. I must say I've never ever heard of any community, however long they've lived in a place, who are keen to have their housing demolished, and I don't think that's peculiar to people in the parts of London that you were just mentioning. However, moving on from that particular issue, the question I wanted to put to you was one that we specifically put earlier on to our previous guests, and so you will have heard what Paul and Richard had to say, and that's how far do you think 250 million will go? in terms of really moving the market forward in terms of the land assembly, the cost of remediation, preparing lands, and is it always going to be land that nobody else wants to buy? How's that going to operate?
The way that it will operate, it's going to be very flexible. This is not a single type of intervention that the money would support. There's lots of different kind of ways the money would be used, but the general principle behind it is that it's for bringing forward land which for whatever reason is not coming forward of its own accord. So it's not about displacing what would happen via other players. So if a council or a housing association or a developer is going to buy the land and get it built quickly anyway, they can. That's good. They can get on with it. And this is more about making sure that if things for whatever reason aren't happening at speed, then we can intervene to sort of unlock sites. And the example in Waltham Forest, it was quite a straightforward, clean example, because that's a site where it was bought by the GLA and then sold on through an agreement to a housing association, and in that case for 100% affordable housing, even with a higher land receipt than was paid for it when it was acquired by the GLA. So that's quite a win-win situation there. That's a I'd say to say this, a relatively straightforward one, where it's a fairly clean site that was acquired and then in a deal passed on to a housing association to build out. There'll be other cases where our intervention is even more targeted and even more focused in a particular way, whether it's about assembling land, whether maybe there's a particular strip of land which is necessary to acquire to unlock a larger opportunity, and whether there's a particular bit of land that needs an infrastructure requirement met, or some remediation action taken to make the whole scheme viable. So there's a lot of different ways that it can feature. I think the other important point is that...
Don't you slightly run the risk then, if people know that you're going to enter the market, if there's a piece of land that's next to something, I don't know whether it's owned by TfL or the Met or housing associations or a local authority, that it then turns into a ransom strip because they think the GLA might be in the market for purchasing it to unlock the development?
I think it's more likely to be the other way around, and that if strips of land already are being used as ransom strips or already being used to hold up development or are not coming forward, we hope that our intervention can help unlock that. I think there are examples I can think of already where we've been involved in where a particular strip of land which has been in the wrong ownership relative to the main developer, that's what I mean, where that has held up the delivery of thousands of homes because the access hasn't been granted or the necessary permissions haven't been given. So there are examples already of where rather than us, our intervention creating a situation, we can see the situation there, and actually there's no other actor who is ready to step in other than the GLA. I think what strikes me is that the GLA as currently is, as we kind of inherited, doesn't have the capacity to do that routinely or at scale. And that's part of the reason why we want to recruit extra people with greater expertise in deal making in the land market and so on, so they have better knowledge of how to intervene in a targeted way.
Well, I'll come on to that in a minute, because obviously you will need more staff to do this. But I mean, you talked about flexibility in a number of different ways in which this money could be used. I mean, is it simply going to be enough though? How many? It's not a great sum of money, 250 million, in the context of the land values in London.
Look, we absolutely acknowledge that given the number of homes that need to be built every year, £250 million is only a start in showing a new way of working and intervening in some key sites to start moving forward. Obviously, we want to make sure that money goes as far as possible. By virtue of it being used on a revolving basis, we hope that we can really get as much value out of it as possible. It's not money that is intended just to be spent and then it's lost. It's money to be used on a revolving basis to bring land forward. But
I do think that might be one of the risks, though. I mean, I think it was Paul who talked about this, and the point at which the money, having been invested, it would then come back to the GLA. If values start to go down, it could be quite difficult. You could potentially end up with less money back. Let's say you paid £25 million for a site and you only end up with 20 million coming back to you. That's going to be slightly difficult if prices appear to be stagnating at the moment, possibly dropping in certain parts of the borough, and of course certain parts of certain boroughs, and of course those might be areas of high housing stress. How will you deal with that level of risk?
In terms of any individual intervention or acquisition, we'd evaluate the risk on a case-by-case basis. I mean, the example of the one in Waltham Forest, the amount we got back in a year later was substantially more than was paid for it a year before. So the indication so far is that there is interventions here, even when that was 100% affordable, still was far from being a burden on the taxpayer. In fact, increased the receipt coming back a year later. But on any individual cases, the risk will be done on a case-by-case basis. And I think we're by no means saying that the £250 million fund is enough to do everything we want to do in terms of scaling up the level of home building in London. And once we've got this new way of intervening in the land market up and running, it's a case we can then make to, for instance, government around greater money, around flexibility in the money we have already. We can work with, for instance, housing associations where they might have the money to acquire the land, but they need us to get involved in terms of our expertise or our powers to help them do so. So it's a first boost into the new direction and the new intervention we want to have in the land market. But it's a start on tackling a huge problem.
Will you be ring fencing it so that if you do make a profit or a surplus, whichever you care to describe it as, it goes up from 250 to 300 million, and so perhaps that might ameliorate the risk on other sites where you might make a slight deficit or loss, depending on your choice of word?
I mean, all of the money is all held on in some level by constituent parts of the GLA or associated bodies. So it will be something which will be set through the budget process, and that will be all set out in the coming months through those.
So it might have some stretch parameters up and down either side of the 250 million.
I really think, to be honest, the 250 million, points us in the right direction and gets us going in terms of intervention we want to have. If we were going to get up to the level of home building which is identified as needed in London, the level of intervention is going to be many times greater magnitude. So I think there's always a bigger question to be had around our access to resources, flexibility over funding, and what we can get from government.
And so where you have put in some kind of investment, I know that because I've seen the things coming back from the planning team suggesting that if a site was previously owned by the health service or other public bodies, that the mayor is now pretty much strictly saying 50% of anything built on that site must be affordable. Is that going to be the line that you'll take if some of this revolving fund has been involved in purchasing, that it will be at least 50% affordable?
So just to be clear on the mayor's current planning policy, so the supplementary planning guidance sets out, because it operates within the national framework where viability assessments do still exist and are still central to the assessment of any planning applications. The way in which we can introduce the 35 or the 50% threshold is in relation to fast tracking applications. So what it's saying is that for your normal private-led sites, we've got the 35% threshold, and if you can hit that, you get the fast track. For land which was or has been or is in public ownership, and then it's a 50% threshold to get fast track through. So it's not saying it's not an absolute requirement because there's still the viability assessment route, which is required by national planning policy. People can go down that route if they believe they have a real case to make on that basis. It's just if you want the fast track route on land which has been in public ownership, you have to go down the 50% route.
Let's assume you're going to put money into sites that might be quite likely to go down the fast track route. Would you be requiring 50% then, if the money has gone in from the GLA, from this revolving fund?
Well, we'd want to maximise the affordable housing as much as possible, and I think it would vary from case to case, because if you, for instance, got an individual little ransom strip that you managed to put into a bigger scheme, you'd work out exactly what that unlocked and what your requirements then were of the housing mix on the bigger site. So I think it would depend on what the sort of intervention was and what the specifics of the case were.
Yes, because obviously if it was remediation, it would also be quite hard to. So in terms of the staff, you were talking about bringing some additional staff. How many more staff do you think will be needed to administer this fund and to ensure that it's used most effectively?
Yeah. So there is going to be, I think, a paper going to the Oversight Committee about this, so that'll set it out. So, it is being drafted at the moment. I think I should probably not reveal what's going to the Oversight Committee because of due process, if that's all right.
Okay. Well, if we can't
I mean,
talk about that,
I can tell you there are going to be more people recruited, and they will help to move us in this, help us to intervene in this new way in the land market. But as I say, the details, it's going to the oversight committee, so that will be later this month, I think.
Okay, well, we might, as a committee, in our response on the housing strategy, obviously want to have a look at that paper and to see whether or not we feel that that is going to be effective. Which brings me on to my final point, was how are we going to judge whether this policy of using this revolving fund of 250 million has been successful? How and when are we going to measure success?
I mean, I think, to be honest, it feeds into the broader targets which we're moving towards. So the principal one being around the starts for affordable housing, the 90,000 affordable home starts by 2021. We would see the land fund and all of the extra staff capacity that we want to recruit as being key in helping to achieve that aim and beyond. I mean, I think that the 90,000 is a very stretching target, and I think we recognise that although we've got some really willing councils and housing associations working with us, they need us to work with them to get more land opportunities to make sure they can meet their targets. So I would see that as being the land fund is a crucial part of feeding into that target.
Thank you, Chairman.
I think Assembly Member Devonish has the next follow-up question.
Just a very quick one, James. Have you got a full list of projects that would make up broadly a £250 million figure yet, draft project list that you're working through, or are we at a much earlier stage?
So there are some potential acquisitions and schemes that we are looking at. I'm going to quite honestly say they are commercially confidential, so we wouldn't want to talk about them in public right now. So there are some ones we're looking at already. Yes, there are some we're looking at. But I think there'll be other ones that come along. Some of them might be much smaller sites, and some of them are bigger ones. So there'll be a variety of different ones that come forward. And because it's a revolving fund, it's not like a one-off program and then it's done. What we would hope is that we can, as you say, keep the money going through and then bring new sites in as and when.
Sure, but you'll try and spend the 250 million initially as soon as possible to pump prime the whole housing growth area, presumably. So will you have a date by when the first pipeline will be, pretty much finished? End of this year, end of next year?
So there are some we're looking at the moment, and as soon as I'm able to tell you about them, we can make them public.
Okay, thank you.
Very much. Assembly Member Gavron has
Very,
a follow-up,
very quick.
but also isn't, you have the next question, so if you want to go straight on to that as well,
okay.
that'd be great.
I'll just quickly ask this question, then go on to the small sites question. Are you considering using the revolving loan fund as a way of incentivising a proportion of the homes built being precision manufactured?
So I think, in a way, I wouldn't want to restrict the use of the land fund too much.
Sure, but as a way of incentivising a proportion, maybe.
I think we can definitely go and have a look at that. I think the only reason I'm hesitating is because what I wouldn't want to happen is that if, let's say, there was an intervention that we could make to unlock a large number of homes, but for whatever reason they weren't going to be developed using off-site manufacture, I wouldn't want that to prevent us from intervening in that way. I think if there was a scheme which could be done with off-site manufacture and we could use a land fund to support that, then that would be great, because that would tick two boxes. It would both accelerate delivery and support off-site manufacture. So certainly if there were schemes which would involve off-site manufacture which are stalled and where us intervening using our land fund would help unlock it, that would be a great opportunity.
It would, it may work very well for constrained sites too. Anyway, it's just a thought. Small sites. Well, you heard the last panel and you heard the discussion there on small sites, but I'm just I'm wondering. I mean, we've got how many years left? 2.5 years left this mayoral term. Have you got any idea of how many homes we'll be building on small sites, or how many small sites will come forward over the next this mayoral term?
So I mean, within the targets, the capacity figures, which are set out in the draft on the plan, that will identify the capacity from small sites as well as from large sites. So in terms of capacity, it will be quite clear, what proportion of the new housing capacity will come from the larger sites versus the smaller sites. So that will be set out. I think then bringing them forward, like ensuring delivery on as many of those small sites as possible, it will be helped by the presumption in favour of development on small sites, which helps de-risk sites, give more certainty to people who want to bring them forward. Some of the work we're doing around public sector sites, we hope will be of use in bringing forward smaller sites in public ownership, which might be particularly well suited for community-led housing, as well as small builders and small housing associations. So I think there's two parts of the answer to that question. There's the first one about the capacity, which we set out within the draft London plan in terms of the overall housing targets. And then there's the question about what we can do using our broader interventions to increase delivery.
Right. Now, the presumption in favour of development, residential development on small sites, will be, presumably that's going to be a policy in the London plan. And that becomes, well, are you assuming it will be of material consideration even before the plan is finally adopted, which isn't until 2019?
My understanding of how it works is it is a material consideration, but I guess it gains weight as it makes its way through becoming a formal adopted plan. And as you know, Nikki, that's a kind of 3-year process, probably at least.
Yeah. Okay. So if it actually, so in fact, because it's in the draft London plan, consultation draft housing strategy, you will be able, people will see it coming, and it will incentivise more residential development on small sites?
Yeah, it gains weight immediately when it's published in draft, and gains weight throughout the process, the various, the consultation and the examination in public and viability assessment and so on. So it gains weight over that time period. Also, it gives a really clear signal, I think, to the broader market that this is the direction it's going in. And if people, see that the London plan examination process, if they see that it's going well, they think, right, well, that's going to be policy in whenever, 2019, I think, it's going to become the plan then. People can see the direction of travel. So if you were a small builder or a community-led housing group considering getting involved in this, just the fact that you're on the pathway towards the London plan with that presumption in favour would help to increase the certainty that you have.
Good. I wanted that answer to be in public. Thank you. Do you see, we talked about risks in the last panel. Do you see any, do you see that there are risks attached to a presumption in favour of development, residential development on small sites?
I think, it's a good question. I suppose the risk from our point of view is that looking at small sites is quite a different process than the big sites, because the big sites you can, to a greater extent, actually identify where, the boroughs can actually identify where they are. The boroughs can actually issue site allocation documents and so on, which are very clear about where the large sites are located, whereas the small sites relies slightly more on trend and windfall and so on. So it's a slightly harder category of sites to you don't give a map of all the small sites. It's more based on the trends and the windfall and the estimated capacity and so on. So it's a slightly different way of approaching it than it is with larger sites. But I think what's clear is that the development on smaller sites, if we can give greater planning certainty, it actually is it can be less risky in one way of looking at it than some of the bigger sites, because if you've got a big site, a large home builder could phase it. They might, if they've got a big portfolio, they might well decide not to develop out a particular site at one point in time and come back to it later. Whereas smaller sites, because they tend to be owned by smaller builders or smaller housing associations or community-led groups and so on, they tend to get built out a lot quicker. So in terms of that part of delivery, there can be less risk. So there are different dynamics to the small sites, and there are larger sites at different stages of the development process.
Yes, that's interesting. Just a couple of observations, though, because we heard about the risks of them not coming forward quickly because of the lack of planning resources in dealing with it. And that was one point that was made. I don't know what you would say to that.
Sorry, could you say that again, Nikki?
In the last panel, it was spelled out in some detail by Barry Mortimer that there were the lack of planning resources, and I think backed up by Richard Blyth.
Oh, I see. Sorry, you mean as in planning officers?
The lack of planning officers, because these are seen to be very difficult sites, there's difficult consultations around them, etc. And I just wondered whether you had any, I could leap to what can the mayor do about it, so to speak?
I think in a way the lack of planning resources is an issue which affects boroughs quite widely. And there are. I think there was in the housing white paper, they spoke around extra planning fees and so on, which could go some way toward increasing capacity in planning services. I think that there's also ways in which boroughs can encourage good design standards on small sites, which hopefully mean that each individual application is less intensive. If they produce good guidance of what well-designed residential accommodation on small sites looks like, then hopefully each individual application is less onerous when it's coming through the system. And that's part of what we want to encourage through the Housing Expo, which is in the draft housing strategy as well, which is about supporting this expo about different typologies for delivering at density, a higher density.
Right. Can I understand that the SHLA, the Housing Land Availability Assessment, actually has, that the boroughs have been asked to estimate on their small sites. Is just a yes/no answer? Is that what you understand? You talked about it being difficult to estimate.
That's what I understand.
Yes, although there's a distinction, so they're asked to estimate the small sites they know about. But in addition, there's a windfall assumption. So sites that we know they're not going to find out about in advance, but some will apply for planning permission. And what we're seeking to do is not only capture the smaller sites that they know about, but also have a planning policy that means more sites can come forward that they don't know about in advance, if you follow me.
Fine.
Just because they're so small, they don't know.
Can I just ask on that? Are we talking about, sort of backland garage sites and... are we talking about previously developed or not being used sites, or are we talking about, and I'm just wondering now, are we talking about sites where, as cinema was mentioned before, change of use? What are you anticipating? Because I can see it being very risky if it's actually looking at change of use of a site as opposed to a derelict or previously developed site which is not in use.
I'd have to confirm with the planners, but my understanding is we're not making a big assumption for an increase in change of use, particularly in relation to things like office to residential, which we know is kind of quite damaging in many respects. But I think the policy is going to be worded quite broadly because the definition of small sites is very broad. So it could be underused sites, it could be vacant sites, it could be garage backland sites, as you said.
I'm looking at a few pocket parks now being turned into infill sites, and I just worry slightly about the way we're going to have competing land uses. I just raise it as an issue, although I'm very behind the presumption, but I think we have to be a bit cautious about it in planning terms. Now, I've got another question here, which is, what would not be appropriate on these sites? What sort of housing would not be appropriate? It's a question I've or rather, if you like, what would be appropriate?
Well, I mean, the housing... we'd have to meet all the space standards and so on around new housing. So it would meet the normal standards which we set out in the plan around housing size and design and so on. And I think getting good design is really important, particularly because this is going to be it's more likely to be in areas where you've got an existing community very nearby, and this is going to be as James said, infill in a particular area. So it's going to be nearby to where other people live at the moment. So I think getting housing which is well designed is really important. I think encouraging good design and encouraging good design to be used widely and encouraging, crucially, higher densities which are well designed is really important. I think Londoners understand that high density doesn't just mean high rise. There are other ways of achieving high density, but I think the more examples they can see around that, the more confidence they'll have in the kind of applications which are coming forward.
There's a threshold, isn't there, for small sites below which you don't have to put any affordable housing on, by any definition. And that's 10, isn't it?
10.
And what I've seen in my experience is that you get lots and lots of small sites with 9 on. And it's done very deliberately. And it's one of the great scams. I'm just wondering, if you aggregated sites, if a borough aggregated sites, would they be able to get affordable housing on a number of sites by aggregating them together?
I mean, having been a councillor for 10 years before this current role, I remember seeing quite a few applications for nine units as well. I think I mean, it really is in a way, and I'm not passing the buck, I'm just being honest, it is up to the local authority, given that those small applications would never come anywhere near us because of the planning threshold. And boroughs are able to ask for payments in lieu in terms of cash contributions from smaller sites toward affordable housing. That's something boroughs are able to do, broadly speaking.
But only if they're over 10.
Assembly Member Gavin, can I possibly interrupt at this point, because we have 15 minutes and 4 questions left, and this is
I'll end on it. What can
something
the mayor,
maybe you can follow up later.
What can the mayor do to? I just thought people might be interested.
We're interested in all of this far too much.
We're bringing forward small sites. How many of these homes are going to be affordable? Is the issue I'm trying to get to.
I agree.
But that's why I mentioned the aggregation point. But what more could if boroughs aren't going to bring forward sites or are slow to, is there anything the mayor can do?
So I mean, the small sites, definition of small sites can go up to 25 homes. So it's over that 10 threshold at the higher end of the small sites. Notwithstanding your point around very small sites, but a lot of what we consider small sites are not under that planning definition small sites. So there would still be affordable housing requirements in those larger schemes. I mean, in terms of the mayor's, what the mayor can do in terms of bringing forward sites, the presumption in favour of development is a really crucial part of what he can do, because that gives certainty in quite a wide sweep for a lot of sites around the planning risk that people would encounter if they tried to bring forward those sites. So that's a really crucial mechanism he can do, because even if we had the biggest Homes for Londoners team you can imagine, we wouldn't have the ability to go out and bring forward or identify every single small site. But by giving this presumption in favour of development, that kind of shifts the dial a bit, so it makes them much more likely to come forward.
Okay.
Thank you. What?
Could you tell me, the previous housing strategies have had targets for family-sized properties. They've had a breakdown for that, but it's not in this strategy. Could you tell me why?
So I might ask James about the previous housing strategy, given you'd have been involved in that. But I mean, within the draft London plan, there'll be expectations around dwelling mixes and so on.
Yes. I know that, but that was my question. Why isn't it in the housing strategy when it was in previous housing strategies? Because this is about investment. This is about what you're going to target, rather than talking about the capacities that we talk about in the London plan. This is about investment. And it looks to me like there isn't the priority that this Assembly has fought for in previous housing strategies.
So funding is available for larger homes, for family-sized homes, and I think the issue with previous housing strategies is about timing. So the previous housing strategy was published after a London plan, so there were already clear planning policies in place for family-sized homes. So as James says, when you see the London plan, you'll see our policies on size mix.
So am I going to see an increase in the number of family-sized homes? Am I going to see a decrease?
Well, that'll be set out in the draft London plan.
Okay. With regard to, do you think we're going to be seeing more small builders building homes in London as a result of your small site strategy?
That's the intention behind the direction we're taking, because the number of small builders, has gone down substantially in the last few years, when you talk to small builders, there are different problems they identify, whether it's planning certainty, whether it's funding, whether it's connected to those 2 points, the availability of land. But I think having the presumption in favour of development will help give that certainty in terms of planning, which means that more small builders will have the confidence in acquiring sites to bring them forward.
Have you in mind a target to know whether or not you've been successful?
There will be small sites targets for the boroughs in terms of delivery on small sites. So that isn't a target for the number of smaller builders, but it's a target for
builders
small
is
sites.
What I'm asking. Is there going to be a target for the increased number of smaller builders that are involved in building homes in London?
I mean, we haven't got a formal target of how many small builders we'd like to see, but we know it's down at a very low level at the moment. And we coming forward with these policies around, particularly in planning, certainty, to try and encourage more small builders to come forward.
Thank you. That's it.
Ask the question a slightly different way. If at the moment, say we've got 80% of the building in London going on with the usual big guys, would you set a target for 20% for the smaller guys, to make it very simple?
We can take it away and get back to you on...
Well, that would be good, because I mean, that's one of the questions I get asked every day by normal Londoners. You know, it's always the usual big guys building.
I mean, the analysis of the problem I agree with, in that I think, you know, the reliance on big home builders, they make a really vital contribution, but they're not going to be able to deliver the homes we need overall. So we do need the other sources of supply. I mean, in terms of a specific number, we can look into that and get back to you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, we have two more sort of topics. One is intensification and regeneration as set out in your plans, and then we want to look at the private rented sector. We're very, very short of time, so at any point if you want to say, we'll write to you about that would be fine.
I'm happy to say on my questions, I would like a good answer on the PRS one, that they can write to us.
Yeah, I think that would
be great.
Yeah.
I will be efficient as possible.
Great, thank you, Assemblyman McCombie. It's an important topic, this.
It is. Could you tell us what you mean by co-location in the strategy?
Sure. At the moment, I'll try and be as efficient in my response as possible. At the moment, for instance, some places in outer London, you know, on a train line, on an underground line, you might well have large industrial estates near there. Lots of single-storey sheds which do you know, various industrial or commercial activities and so on. What we need to do is to make sure that we're getting more housing out of those sites, but also protecting London's capacity for industrial uses. And so co-location would be a key way of saying to the applicant for one of those sites, can you intensify the industrial uses, maybe by having, you know, multi-storey industrial uses for industrial buildings, for instance, rather than just single-storey sheds over the whole site. And that will then free up a proportion of the land, maybe nearer the tube station, for housing. That would be the kind of one of the really main examples of co-location. I mean, there are more straightforward co-location examples where you've got shops or social infrastructure with housing on top or behind. You know, there's the kind of classic ones. But I think the exciting one, or the one where it hasn't really been done very much at all recently, but where there is potentially a lot of capacity if we can encourage it in the right way, is around the co-location and intensification of industrial and residential uses.
So like having multi-storey logistics depots or whatever, which
that kind of
aren't
thing,
very
yeah.
common here. Yeah. I mean, we did look at this on the planning committee, I think, not
Anecdotally,
yes.
Anecdotally, there have been a few home builders we've spoken to already where they've acquired sites which are currently used for industrial uses, and we sort of pushed them to say, well, come on, can you really go and think about how you can do this differently, rather than just flipping it to residential as you've been used to doing? Can you team up with someone who understands industrial development? Can you do co-location and so on? And actually, the results so far have been quite positive. So I think it is a bit of a shift in terms of how people think about it, but it's going to be important for unlocking that extra capacity.
What groups of Londoners would co-location work for, and how do we know?
I mean, it depends hugely on the site and the specifics of it. I mean, if you on the example I gave of, if you've got a large industrial estate or a large piece of land used for industrial uses near a tube station in outer London, you know, building some new housing near to the tube station could be ideal for Londoners who are trying to buy their first home, or, you know, working in central London but wanting somewhere where they can start a family. I mean, there's all sorts of variants on it. I think what's important is to make sure that the design of the co-location is sensitive to what the industrial uses are. So industrial uses covers obviously quite a broad range of different sorts of activities, and if you had ones which are particularly odour producing or whatever, or noisy, that might not be appropriate to be, you know, residential. Whereas, you know, a lot of industrial uses aren't that noisy, or the hours are not antisocial, or so on, and so it might be more possible to co-locate them. And I mean, there are other solutions. There was a scheme still down in Greenwich, down the bottom of the Greenwich Peninsula. I can't remember its name off the top of my head, but it's one where you've got housing and you've got a huge kind of mineral plant right next door to it, and sound insulation, which means you can't hear it, but you can see it, which is quite strange to see that happening, and you can't hear any noise coming from it. But it just shows that with some of the solutions they have these days, you can do it.
Okay. And there's anyone else wants to come on the co-location, I'll move to the next.
I just want to say, Jules seemed to take this up with some interest in the planning committee, that you could have the agent of change principle applied to some of the co-location sites. So it was incumbent on whoever was doing the residential bit the residential bit, to ensure that it wasn't going to, that the industrial wasn't going to impinge on the people living in the residential bit.
Yeah, I mean, depending on who is leading what part of the development at what phase.
Yeah.
I guess would probably depend whether you would do it as a overall master plan that you wanted to be happy worked in and of itself, or whether you need to apply agent of change. Because agent of change, I think, and as I understand it, agent of change would be more likely to apply to new development coming alongside an existing one, rather than a whole regeneration all done at the same time. But I think the principle is absolutely right.
So moving on to infrastructure, how will you meet your house building targets if the government doesn't fund the infrastructure projects which unlock large sites?
Well, I think we've been, we're being very clear, and the London plan will set this out very clearly, that the kind of capacity targets, the kind of 66,000 identified by need and then identified through capacity studies, getting to anywhere near those kind of numbers does require substantial investment in infrastructure. It requires investment in things like Crossrail 2 and other infrastructure projects across the board. So infrastructure is a key part of that, and we're very clear in both the housing strategy, and we will be in the London plan, that getting home building up to that kind of level we need will require government to play its part.
So we can't get there without, for example, the government committing properly to Crossrail 2?
We'll need them to make those commitments to infrastructure to increase home building to those levels.
There's no plan B?
Well, it's infrastructure investment. I mean, you need to invest in infrastructure to get home building up.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Devonish.
I think it would be good to have a written answer on the PRS rather than a very quick answer now.
Yeah, we've got two questions coming from the private rented sector, to do with your private rented sector partnership and then the London rental standard. I wonder if maybe we can write to you with our questions about that. Assembly Member Copley, did you have anything you wanted to do that you were going to ask the final question? Do you have anything to ask about?
No.
Should we put it in the letter?
I'm happy for us to get a written.
Yeah, I'd rather do it properly if that's okay.
Yeah.
But thank you for the extra time you've given us today. It's been very interesting. Obviously, this is an important topic where a lot is at stake. So yeah, we've had tough questions, but thank you for answering them all. Right. So finally, can I ask the committee to note the report in the agenda for item 6?
Agreed.
And item 7 on the agenda is our work programme. Can you agree the update to the work programme that's in the reports?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. The date of the next meeting is the 5th of December, and I have no other urgent business today, so thank you very much everyone.